This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 102 of William Campbell's Here's How for the 15th of April 2020. And don't click away, you haven't made an awful mistake. William will be with us in a moment.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Now today, William will be doing most of the talking as usual, but not at the start. My name is Cathal McCullagh, and yes, that is a name you might remember from morning radio back in the Stone Age. And the reason I'm here is because William, welcome by the way, William, to your own podcast.
Thank you.
William has made some news himself by not just raising an issue here on the podcast, but taking it further. What we're talking about here is a complaint about the broadcasting of AA Roadwatch on RTE, which, William, you've made to the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, or the BAI.
That's right.
It's sometimes called. Now, they've just ruled on it, and as you'll hear, your complaint and RTE's response to it, and the BAI's ruling on it is what we're going to be talking about today. So that's why for this William Campbell podcast, I'm the interviewer, and William, you're the interviewee. Now, two things I should make clear before we begin. We're talking to each other on Skype, so we're observing all the guidance on social distancing to protect people from COVID-19. And I'm here purely in the role of interviewer, not to express a view on what you're about to hear. And I should add that William made it clear I can ask him any question I like. Any question, William?
Any question.
Right, this should be interesting. Now, the complaint you made to the BII about the broadcasting of AA Roadwatch, what exactly were you complaining about?
Well, the core of what I'm complaining about is that AA Roadwatch is a very strange thing on RTE. It's not like anything else on RTE in the sense that one advertisement is the same quality as another advertisement. One sponsored program has the same quality as another sponsored program. The AA is a registered lobby group, and you might be aware that since 2015, the Registration of Lobbyists Act means that people who lobby the government, organisations who knock on the doors of Leinster House and say, hey, we want you to change the law in our favour, they're required by law, by the Standards in Public Office Act, to register and say what they do and register each time that they make a contact with an official or with a minister or TD or whatever. And the reason for that is, and you'll know this well, Cathal, we had decades of problems with politicians being influenced improperly. Now, I'm not suggesting that the AA has done anything improper, but the AA, like, for example, the IFA, their job is to put as much money in the pockets of their campaign, of their people, as anybody else. So the IFA, their job is to basically look after the interests of farmers. The AA is to look after the interests of the motor industry, which essentially means making sure that the most number of people in Ireland drive the most. And the AA has been extraordinarily successful at campaigning against public transport and extraordinarily successful at campaigning in favour of road building. And the result of that is that we have enormous traffic jams in Ireland, despite having the lowest population density in the EU 15 or 14, I guess now. We have very, very poor access to public transport. We've had enormous delays in completing projects like the Lewis, and really ludicrous decisions taken. And, for example, the AA was at the heart of the campaign to punch the centre out of the Lewis network, so that originally the two Lewis lines didn't join up. Now, you or I might like that or not like that, Cathal, but the AA is in a democracy. You know, they're entitled to campaign for whatever they want, and people are entitled to campaign against them.
Right, well, that's your overall reservation about the AA.
Sure. No, it's not really a reservation. You know, I might disagree with the Irish Farmers Association, but I don't deny them their right to lobby.
Well, let's before we go into the depths of this, and first of all, I should say that I know you want to thank all of your donors on Patreon, and that you appreciate everyone who does that. If you don't know, by the way, Patreon is basically a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 or €1 or €2 per podcast or per month, and that helps William to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. Now, if you think that you could do the same as those donors, there are details on the website, and William will give them at the end of the show. But let's go through, in your usual pop pickers way that I know that you do, just the main points of your problem with AA Roadwatch.
Okay, well, let's do that. At number 5, RTE is allowing an external body to select topics, write scripts and broadcast live, with no intervention or editorial control from RTE. This is in direct contravention of their legal duty. At number 4, RTE allows the AA to use AA Roadwatch to highlight its signature campaign topic, traffic congestion, in 12,000 bulletins per year, totally unfair on opposing campaigners. At number 3, and this one's important, the AA is a registered political lobby group competing with other lobbyists and campaigners. AA Roadwatch gives them an air of impartial authority, so that when Conor Faulkner goes on other programmes arguing against public transport, he's wrongly presented not as an industry campaigner, but as a neutral expert witness. At number 2, the AA is an insurance business, and allowing them the massive exposure they get from AA Roadwatch is unfair to competing businesses. And at number 1, sponsorship by any political lobbyist is prohibited, so the AA as a registered political lobby group shouldn't be allowed to sponsor anything on RTE regardless of the content.
Well, that certainly sets out the complaint very clearly. And the first thing we should ask before we come on to the finding of the broadcasting authority on your complaint, I should ask you this. Did you make a complaint directly to RTE as you're required to do under their code?
Yes, I did. RTE put some obstacles in the way of me doing that, but the BAI don't accept complaints that haven't first been referred to RTE.
How do you mean obstacles?
What is set out on the RTE website is that you must make a complaint, and that if you're not satisfied with the complaint, you must refer that complaint to a more senior person in RTE, and if you are unsatisfied with the complaint with the response of the more senior person, you can then refer to the BAI. RTE were reluctant to pass on to the second stage, but in the event, I got an email from RTE saying that they weren't going to consider it any further, and the BAI took it from there.
Right. Now, you've set out your case, and the Broadcasting Authority have looked into it, heard your complaint, RTE's response, and have now issued their finding. And basically the finding, it appears to me, is they've rejected your complaint completely. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
There are a number of points here which are interesting. Before we get on to the generalities, because one of the reasons that I was interested in your complaint is it raises some very serious issues, although there are specific problems with your complaint. Specifically, they say that first of all, the code doesn't prohibit sponsorship. The broadcasting code doesn't prohibit sponsorship of current affairs programs. And then they go on to say that this, in their view, isn't sponsorship anyway. What do you make of that?
Well, you have to understand what is sponsorship. And the RTE guidelines are very clear. They say that if a company pays in cash or kind, so in other words, if they give money, or if they give, say, a prize to give away on a program, or they give anything else of value towards the production of the program, and number 2, they get a name check. That's to say their brand or their company name is promoted. That's sponsorship. Now, RTE made the correct observation that there is an exception in there, that when there is an independent production, so when a separate company, usually these small companies are maybe ex-RTE presenters, and RTE is by law required to spend a specific budget every year on independent productions with the policy goal of developing the broadcasting industry in Ireland, the independent broadcasting industry. So when, for example, Miles Dungan presents the History Show, if Miles Dungan has to buy a new biro for his office when he's presenting the History Show, he pays for that himself, and that is not considered a sponsored program. But regardless of the sponsorship, the rule that's being broken here is that the BAI have a very, very clear policy that groups that have a political end are not permitted to have any commercial communications on RTE. So commercial communication would be an advertisement. So in the election, you're not allowed to hear an ad that says vote Fianna Fáil, and you're not allowed to hear an ad that says join Greenpeace or any other organization. Doesn't have to be a political party, but any organization that has a political end. And a commercial communication is either an advertisement or a sponsored program. And what RTE are saying, essentially, is that despite the fact that AA Roadwatch pays the rent on the studios from which AA Roadwatch is broadcast, these are in South William Street in Dublin, it's not broadcast from RTE, as you will know, Cathal. And in addition, they pay the salaries of all the staff, so they're paying basically the entire cost of AA Roadwatch. And that seems to bring them within the sponsorship rules. RTE are saying no, independent radio producers are exempt from this rule because, of course, they have to pay for their running costs. They have to pay their staff, they have to pay, and so forth. But I would argue that an independent production, for example, the History Show with Miles Dungan, that independent production pays the immediate cost, pays the salaries and the costs of making that program, and then bills RTE so that RTE pays the ultimate cost. A sponsored program is a program where some of the cost is paid by the sponsor and that is not refunded by RTE. So that ultimate cost lies with the sponsor, and their consideration, the reason that they pay for that, is to get the exposure, to get their name out there.
The problem with that is that that's your view.
Mm-hmm.
And you put that to the BAI and they rejected it.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially they have accepted the case made by RTE that this is a commercial arrangement for the provision of an information service.
Hold on with that. A commercial arrangement is a phrase that seems designed not to convey any information.
Exactly. We don't know what it is. We don't know who's paying. I assume from the wording that RTE are paying the AA for providing this service.
I understand that's not correct.
The AA provide for all kinds of for several other radio stations.
I understand that's not correct. I have sources within RTE, which are not you and not connected to you, I should make it clear, who indicate that the great bulk of the cost is met by the AA, that RTE have provided some technical assistance, in other words, connecting up the South William Street building to Montrose, but that the great bulk, the salaries of those people who present, are paid by the AA. And that's a good deal for the AA because, they have to pay, there's about 15 people part-time there, but that, 12,000 slots a year is a huge amount of advertising for the AA.
This is a point now which they don't address, the BAI doesn't address, but it is a fair issue. In other words, we should know more about this commercial arrangement for everybody.
But a commercial arrangement, Carl, a commercial arrangement could be paid for with a few lines of cocaine in the back of a nightclub somewhere in Dublin.
Well, we're not talking about that. Come on.
No, but that would be within the definition of a commercial arrangement.
Yeah, but anyway, the point is we don't know what it is. I personally, I think a lot of people would like to know. But getting back to the issue of the role of the AA, because the BAI say in their finding rejecting your complaint that they agree that the AA does political lobbying. But they say there's no evidence in the broadcasts that this is skewing public debate or that it's unfair to rival businesses or to campaigners in a way that infringes any code. And that's an important part of the ruling.
Well, have a listen to this then, Cathal. Have a listen to these excerpts.
You only have to listen to AA Roadwatch in the morning. The N4 and the N7 feature absolutely on every single...
I appreciate that, but I would put it to you, Minister, that the N11 is an extreme case. Anecdotally, turn on AA Roadwatch in the morning, driving in, and on many mornings, given every road...
In my area, Dunkettle interchange, and OPW need to be more forthcoming with their money.
We hear about the Dunkettle roundabout every morning on AA Roadwatch. Now we move.
The road into Adair has been named by AA Roadwatch as one of the country's worst in terms of traffic tailbacks.
It is such a major junction that it features regularly on the AA Roadwatch reports. Now, it's come to my attention...
And I got those, Cathal, from, obviously from the Dáil. Those are all Dáil speeches. Those are all TDs and senators speaking. And in each case, what they're saying is, usually to some minister, I want money spent on some road in my constituency, and the evidence that I'm providing that you should spend this money on my road in my constituency is that I listen to AA Roadwatch, and this road features frequently on AA Roadwatch. And there's one more particularly, and you'll be familiar with Catherine Murphy. She's now one of the leaders of the Social Democrats. And this clip is from 2006. Have a listen to this.
And I don't know if you listen to AA Roadwatch. Well, I tend to listen to it. You will never, ever listen to it without hearing one particular area mentioned, and that's the Westlink toll bridge. Because every single solitary time AA Roadwatch comes on, the toll bridge is mentioned. It's a crisis. Something has to be done about it, and it could be done by raising those barriers, and that is about covering the cost of doing that, and I think that is something that could be done in the short term. I don't think...
Now, that's from 2006, as I said. At that time, the AA were running a campaign, and they had the slogan, raise the barriers. They were running a campaign to have the cost of the toll, which you have to throw in some coins into the basket as you cross the bridge. It's different now. Their campaign was to have that cost transferred to the taxpayer. And in that clip, which is from Catherine Murphy, who's a respected TD in the Dáil, who's certainly not a fool, she is essentially saying, I'm supporting the same option that the AA is supporting because of what I hear on AA Roadwatch. I don't think you could get a clearer example that they are influencing political and public debate.
Yeah, this brings me back to one of the obvious weaknesses of your case, which is under the code, the broadcasting code as the Broadcasting Authority applies it, which is you have to have a specific instance on a programme on air and saying that breached the code. Whereas what you're doing is you're raising a fair enough general issue of whether this is a desirable thing for a motoring lobby organisation to be involved in providing motoring information. Although we should mention they do provide some information about trains and trams as well. But essentially you're making a general point, and the BAI is not the place to bring a general point because they only deal with specific complaints.
Well, first and foremost, they dodge, and I think the BAI have a lot of questions to answer here as well. It is possible to bring a complaint against a series of programs, and they just declined to accept a complaint against AA Roadwatch as a series, and I think it's clearly, obviously, a series of programs. But to look at that more in general, that the requirement, and you'll know this very well, Cathal, the requirement on RTE is to provide fair and impartial coverage. There is a huge debate in Ireland about the route in which transport planning should go. Should we build more roads, or should we invest in public transport? And that debate is shaped by what people hear on the radio. And that will include debates and so forth. But those debates on public transport might be half a dozen a month if you went across the whole of RTE radio. Whereas every morning, 12,000 times a year, you're told how terrible road traffic is. Well, and road traffic in Ireland is terrible. There's no question about that. But transport for people using public transport is pretty terrible as well. And transport for people who live outside the reach of public transport is pretty awful and is never mentioned ever.
Yeah, as I say, I understand the general point. I think it's fairly obvious from the BAI ruling on your complaint that there was no code. You didn't have any specific complaint to make about a specific program or item, and their code doesn't really deal with sort of general issues, which is what you're raising. Now, it's a valid issue, but it's a general issue. Can I just come on to something else that just struck me, and I think it was an unfair point that you made, which is this. You're saying that Conor Faulkner, for example, is somebody who argues against public transport. Now, I've heard Conor Faulkner, who's the head of the AA, frequently make the case for public transport. Of course, he represents his members and the interests of his members, but he's certainly not somebody who's argued against public transport. In fact, most times
no, not correct. I would
he's arguing for it, not against it.
Cathal, I would disagree with you there. If the IFA came on the radio and advocated that farmers should be allowed to put poison in the food that they feed us, nobody would take them seriously. And Conor Faulkner is very clearly aware that if he made a bold argument against any public transport, it would damage his credibility enormously. And essentially, Conor Faulkner will come on and say how brilliant that public transport systems are in Paris or Rome or San Francisco. And the bottom line is, the further away it is, the better he likes it. They restrict themselves very cleverly not to arguing against public transport in principle. They argue against whatever is the item that is up for consideration now. And they say, well, public transport, all good and well, but really we should have a public consultation on this for a couple of years, and then maybe a redesign that'll take another couple of years, and the government has changed and priorities have changed. And that's exactly how the Luas ended up costing vastly more than it should have, and being incredibly inconvenient, having the two lines broken up in the original design, because they campaigned against it going through the city centre.
Two other things that strike me are, in relation, first of all, to the fact that the AA, the AA is an insurer, and therefore it's in competition with other companies who are providing insurance. And I think whatever the BAI says, I think it's fairly obvious that, although they don't mention insurance in the broadcast, it's no harm. In fact, has to be a positive benefit to have the AA mentioned several times a day, and not just on RTE, of course, we should mention too, because they're providing reports. But the public are not fools. The public are going to go for the best deal wherever they find it. They're not going to go and insure with the AA because the AA is on the radio.
All of these businesses advertise. The AA gets this advertising, a much more prominent advertising than any other business. I don't have any particular incentive to argue the case for other insurance companies. But the bottom line is that all of these companies pay for advertising because they believe that it will improve their business. And I can't believe that that particular advertising doesn't assist the AA. And it's also notable that the AA pay for advertising for, particularly within Morning Ireland, that goes up very close to that. But the bottom line is, it doesn't matter. The Broadcasting Act is absolutely clear. RTE is required to be fair and impartial. And if you are the organisation arguing that we should have less road building and more public transport, you're immediately at an enormous disadvantage because of the brand recognition that the AA has. And just very simply, if you cut from the White House or from the Dáil and breathlessly go to hear that there's, traffic is slow but moving on the Lower Glanmire Road, that presents a position to the public that says that traffic is an urgent national priority in the way that the transport difficulties of people who don't use cars isn't presented.
That's a fair point. But let's just come back and I'll just get your overall reaction to this, which is, let's just remind ourselves of what the BAI said, in fairness, in their ruling on your complaint. They say the code doesn't prohibit sponsorship of current affairs programmes. They don't consider the AA Roadwatch as a sponsored programme because they say it's not current affairs or news. They don't consider it sponsored by the AA. They say the arrangements for AA Roadwatch don't influence the scheduling or content or the editorial independence of RTE. And they say, yes, the AA does political lobbying, but there's no evidence in the broadcasts that skews public debate or are unfair to rival business or campaigners in a way that infringes any code. Now, you've raised a valid issue, which is why I'm happy to talk to you about it. But at the same time, you've put it to the BAI, and you've got a fairly resounding no case to answer, unproven, we reject your complaint.
Well, it's absolutely true that they've rejected the complaint. There are a number of ways in which the complaint was handled that don't inspire confidence in their independence. Particularly, it's clear that they were having undisclosed correspondence with RTE as to how they would handle the complaint. I managed to wring some of that correspondence out of them. Others they have declined to supply. So, the BAI is a quasi-judicial body. I would argue that they're required to give a fair chance and fair treatment to both sides when they're making
Well, I've no way of knowing whether that's an entirely fair judgment, and obviously that they're not here to represent themselves. But can I put the general point to you, this general question, which is this, that the public want traffic information. Now, I'm a cyclist. I have other interests, and they're public transport users. Most people don't drive to work, but a lot of them do, and there's a demand for this service. So if the AA have the information within certain guidelines and rules and controls and so on, why not get that information from them? Isn't that getting a service to the public that nobody else could provide?
Well, A, it's not true that nobody else can provide it. I'll come back to that in a moment. But B, I would question the utility of it. They rattle off about half a dozen street names with an adjective saying something like slow but moving or jammers or whatever. That doesn't really tell me very much. And of course, any person listening to that particular bulletin, any driver has about a 1% chance that one of the streets that they drive down will be one that is mentioned in that. Whereas about 99% of drivers in Ireland have a smartphone in their pocket. They can tap in their destination in about 5 seconds, and they can see on Google Maps which streets are green for traffic faster than usual, which streets are red for traffic slower than usual. But to just address your broader point, there are about 15 at any given time presenters on the staff of AA Roadwatch. They are sitting in the office of a registered political lobbyist. They are sharing that office with Conor Faulkner, who's one of the most prominent political lobbyists in the country. And their salary is paid by a political lobbyist. It is naive beyond anything I can imagine to think that where the content of what they're saying tends to support or undermine their employer, that they won't err on the side of supporting their employer. And a very clear example was for the Luas. And at the same time that Conor Faulkner was knocking on doors in Leinster House saying we don't want to be doing any more building the second phase of the Luas or whatever, his presenters on AA Roadwatch, on radio and so forth, were emphasizing over and over again how the Luas was causing traffic problems, how Luas works. And for several years, for the entire construction of the Luas, AA Roadwatch almost didn't miss a bulletin telling us how much the Luas was a problem. That is directly supporting the political aims of AA's lobbying.
But getting back to the service, for which there's obviously a demand, and I don't
believe there is
an
obviously
enormous
a demand.
Public outcry saying get this off the radio, or they shouldn't be doing it. If they have the information, why not get it from them?
Sure,
I don't know
see why that
the
means.
AA is a motoring organisation, but they also have information that people would like to hear.
Well, isn't that RTE's job? Couldn't you say, well, Fianna Fáil have political information, let's let them present the politics programme?
No, because Fianna Fáil is not
they're not a neutral participant.
If the AA say that the Navan Road is chock-a-block, fact, we can usually take it, and I think most people do take it, that's true. You wouldn't ask Fianna Fáil for that kind of information.
And why are we broadcasting that in Donegal?
Well, they do.
Yeah, but that seems a ludicrous thing to do. But the bottom line is, who's selecting the facts? It is not just what is said, whether what is said is true or not. What's important is whether what they're saying is selected to support a particular case. And for example, it is, I would have thought it's blindingly obvious that the junctions, particularly Knockline Junction, has become almost a cliche, and what they're selecting is major traffic junctions that serve middle class areas of South Dublin. If you're waiting for a bus that doesn't come in the rain in Ballybock, that will not be mentioned on AA Roadwatch.
Fair enough, but who would be in a position to provide that information?
It's in Google. It's in my pocket. I can see the traffic conditions on every road in Ireland. It won't tell you what the state of the bus service is. Actually, it does.
It tells you how many people are on the next bus.
It does not tell you which one is full, but it tells you whether it's late.
It's a very different kind of animal from individuals and cars, whose commuting habits and based on the kind of infrastructure we've built. I mean, if I listen to the Parkmore Industrial Estate in Galway, yet again, surprise, surprise, it's practically a guaranteed traffic jam, and so many more around the country.
So you're saying it's not news?
But I think that brings me just back to, which is why I think you've raised a very important issue, which is where we get the information and what it. Not that at least I don't think it's particularly skewed other than in obvious ways, but whether or not it should come from motoring organisation when motoring is only part of what we do as commuters and most people don't travel in cars. But that's a general editorial policy issue rather than a specific complaint, which is why I think the complaint didn't work.
And one of the issues, Cathal, one of the issues
keep going on about, because it is a valid issue.
But one of the issues, Cathal, there is, and take the AA out of the equation entirely. If you mention something 12,000 times a year on the radio, that clearly is a signal to the public that this is something important that you should be talking about, that you should tackle your politicians with, and that you should try to influence public policy with. If you don't mention something else at all, then that doesn't occur so frequently in the public mind. And the fact that we put traffic congestion 12,000 bulletins a year, and the difficulties, for example, of people who live outside the reach of public transport doesn't get mentioned at all, that skews the news debate.
Which raises the question how we're going to cater for these people. I mean, which is another problem that strikes me, that if you're stuck out in Tyrrell stands, let's say, and the bus is full, and the next bus isn't going to come for 18 minutes, and it's raining, and there's no bus shelter where you're standing, that's an issue for everyone at that bus stop.
Yeah.
And it's also a discouraging factor for people who might want to use the buses.
And if that was mentioned 12,000 times a year, that would have an impact.
It's very hard to see how in a national radio service that could be dealt with on an ongoing basis. Because if you're stuck at the bus stop, you're stuck at the bus stop. It doesn't matter what RTE say. Or News Talk or any station tell you about the bus service, you're just stuck because there is no bus and it's raining. Whereas if you're in a car, you can do something different.
I'm not sure that you can. I think that the information is essentially guff in AA Roadwatch. It is of at the absolute best minimal use to anyone. The proportion of listeners who are on or are planning to go on one of 6 particular streets that they rattle off is minuscule. And the proportion of those who can actually do something about it, who have a choice to go on a different street, isn't worth talking about.
Right. But if there's a truck has overturned on the M50 between Junction 5 and Junction 6 southbound, that's information worth telling people about, isn't it?
Yeah, and RTE brings information worth telling people about across a whole range of topics. I don't see any reason why RTE can't do that either.
No, what I'm saying is if the AA have an accumulation of information about events that are happening as they happen. Now, it's partial. It's certainly not countrywide in the sense of, is Letterkenny covered? Or if there's a traffic jam in Ennis, do they know about it? Clearly not. But they do have a fair body of information. And
But they have a fair body of information because they employ people. Hold on, Carl.
But it's very hard to say we don't want that information at all, or it shouldn't be provided by the AA.
Well, if they have a fair body of information, that's because they collect it. And I would have thought that that's RTE's job in all sorts of areas.
Yeah, but indeed, hold on a minute.
Indeed,
RTE, as we all know, has not got a cent to spend on extra services. They have enough problem in doing the services they're committed to at the moment.
You and I can agree to disagree about the level of efficiency and salaries and so forth in RTE. But the bottom line is that that's not an excuse that flies with political news. That's not an excuse that flies with farming news. That's not an excuse that flies with any other specialist information that RTE gives out.
Now, in
and
the country
indeed, if the AA wanted to be so generous, they could just send in the information.
True, because we know that sponsorship goes on and information about markets, for example, both livestock markets and the currency and stock exchange markets is provided by, for example, stockbrokers. Is provided by marts, and that's something that is rife throughout radio in this country, leaving us quite apart from RTE.
Well, there's one thing. It is one thing for example, stockbrokers or marts with cattle prices to email in or whatever the information, and RTE then
not to email. I'm talking about broadcasting live on radio.
So, do they have studios in the IFA headquarters from which they broadcast? Do they have studios?
No, but I frankly don't know. But the point is that they've live access to radio stations up and down the country, providing information which they have, and which radio stations are not in a position to go and get easily or without expense or spending money that they don't have.
The bottom line is that AA have total editorial control over this. Nobody in RTE sees the script before it goes out.
Yeah, that's the problem, which is why the general issue you raised is a valid one. But on the specifics, I think I can see why your complaint fell down, because you weren't able, or you didn't mention any specifics in your complaint, and therefore you couldn't say that there was that bit of information which was clearly not partial or clearly biased. So in a way, you've raised a valid issue, but not in a forum or under a code where it was ever going to get anywhere.
Sure. And let me, by analogy, reply to that. The BAI very frequently, when somebody puts in and I would have to say I have an element of sympathy with the BAI, that sometimes they get complaints that are a bit off the wall. And you'll have had it on Morning Ireland yourself, an instance when perhaps you interview Leo Varadkar, and somebody will have sent in a complaint and said, you interviewed Leo Varadkar and you didn't interview Micheál Martin. And the BAI will always rule against those type of complaints because they say over time RTE achieves balance. So this week they'll have a headline interview with Leo Varadkar. Next week they'll have it with Mary Luke MacDonald. The week after that they'll have it with Micheál Martin, or however it goes. But if every single week they had a headline with Leo Varadkar, a headline interview with Leo Varadkar, and never ever with another party leader, that would clearly be a breach of the law. And when the BAI say that, no, hang on a second, this one instance of interviewing just one person doesn't count as unfairness because they achieve fairness over time, you have to, by analogy, say, well, hang on a second, if it's possible to achieve fairness over time, it is possible to achieve unfairness over time. And giving one lobby group 12,000 slots a year and nothing else to any other lobby group, that seems clearly unfair over time. However, your point is correct that system is the complaint system is not set up to deal with that.
Which I think leads us to what I wanted to end with, because, as I say, I think this is a valid issue. I mean, for example, for RTE to call their main current affairs program the evening drive time, when most people who are moving home at the end of the working day are not driving. But anyway, leaving that aside, it says something about kind of an attitude to the norm, to motorised car traffic as being the norm, and cycling and walking and sitting in a bus or a tram or a train, which is what most of us do, is somehow marginalised. So that's what I want to ask you about at the end. Leaving the AA aside for a moment, park that for a moment, what would you like to see to make what most of us do when we're travelling more fairly and accurately and informationally represented on RTE or on any radio station?
I think that might be above my pay grade, but I think for sure.
Let me ask it anyway.
I think for sure.
To put you under pressure.
Yeah, that the reality of most people's lives should be reflected on our national airwaves. And people who are being packed onto crowded buses, and people who live in maybe smaller towns or villages around Ireland who have literally zero access to public transport. I'd like to see that highlighted.
Okay, the question is how, and I think that's probably a question for another podcast. I think we'll leave it there. But before I go, first of all, I want to compliment you on raising this.
Thank you.
And I've been putting a lot of the negatives to you, which is inevitable given that you made a complaint and it was rejected. But I do think you've raised really important issues. And I congratulate you on doing that. I should mention, by the way, before we finish, to thank you, first of all, for the invitation to sit in the interviewer's chair and put you under pressure. But I should also say that anyone listening to us, advising them to go to the website for sources and for references from this show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook. You can follow the show, William Campbell's show, on Twitter at Here's How Podcast. And thank you again, William, for having me on.
Thank you, Carl.
Make your view heard. Record your own contribution and email it to podcast@here'show.ie. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Before I go, I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote time to research and to finding interesting guests. And if you, listener, could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast was produced by me and presented by Cathal McQuillia. Thanks again to Cathal, and thank you for listening.